They say you can tell who a person really is by the way they treat someone who has nothing to offer. That day, I learned the truth of that sentence in the most unexpected way. It was a gray Thursday morning, the kind that feels like the sky forgot how to be blue. I had just left an important meeting, one of those nerve-shattering ones where everyone wears masks made of politeness. I was trying to start my car in the parking lot of a diner I didn't even like, my heels sinking into puddles, my patience wearing thin. The engine coughed once, then died with a final pathetic sigh. "Come on, not today," I whispered, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. Rain began to fall harder, each drop slicing the air with cold indifference. Around me, the world seemed to blur. Neon lights reflected in puddles. The scent of wet asphalt mixing with coffee from the diner, a city too busy to care. That's when I saw him. At first, he was just another shadow under the awning, a man hunched over a shopping cart filled with scraps. His coat too big for his frame, his hands tucked inside torn gloves. He watched me for a moment, then started walking my way. I locked my car door instinctively. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to get too close. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep but soft, almost apologetic. "Looks like you've got engine trouble." I hesitated. "Yeah, it won't start." He nodded once, eyes flicking toward the car. "Mind if I take a look? Used to be a mechanic. A long time ago." I looked at him. The dirt under his fingernails, the rain dripping from his unshaven chin, the weight of years etched into his face. Everything about him screamed trouble. Inside the diner, two men in suits were watching. One of them laughed and said loud enough for me to hear, "Careful, lady, he might drive off with your car." They chuckled. I felt heat crawl up my neck, not just from embarrassment, but shame. Shame for even hesitating. The man saw it too. His shoulders slumped a little, like he'd seen that look 1,000 times before. He turned as if to leave. "Wait," I said. He looked back. "If you can fix it," I said, my voice unsteady, "I'll buy you something to eat." Something flickered in his eyes. Not greed, not pity. Gratitude, quiet and simple. He gave a small nod. "Deal." He lifted the hood with practiced hands, rain streaming down his coat, his breath fogging in the cold. I stood beside him with an umbrella, watching. His movements were deliberate, precise, nothing like the clumsy fumbling I expected. He listened to the engine the way a musician listens to an instrument gone slightly out of tune. "Battery's fine," he murmured. "But your ignition coil's corroded. You've been driving through puddles lately?" I blinked. "Yes, how did you—" He smiled faintly. "You can hear it. The click before it dies. Seen it 100 times. The men inside the diner were still watching." One of them mouthed something that looked like unbelievable. He reached into his cart, rummaged through the chaos, and pulled out a small metal box. Tools. Clean ones. I didn't even know what to say. "Found these in a junkyard last year," he said. "Never let go of 'em. Never know when a machine needs a little mercy." He crouched, wiped his hands on his coat, and started working. Wires, bolts. The quiet rhythm of someone who remembered what purpose felt like. The rain fell harder, blurring the edges of the world, turning the parking lot into a mirror of gray. And somewhere between the sound of rain and the hum of the city, I realized I was holding my breath. 20 minutes later, he stood up, wiped his hands, and said, "Try it now." I slid into the driver's seat, heart thudding, and turned the key. The engine came to life. Smooth, strong, confident, like it had never faltered. I looked at him through the windshield, stunned. He just smiled. A tired, almost boyish smile that didn't belong on a man who'd lost so much. When I stepped out, I said the first thing that came to mind. "How did you know what to do?" He shrugged. "Some things you don't forget, like fixing engines or being hungry." The words hit harder than he probably meant them to. I pulled out a few bills, enough for a warm meal and maybe a place to sleep. He looked at the money, then at me, and shook his head. "I said food, ma'am, not charity." I blinked. "But—" He smiled again, softer this time. "There's a diner right there. You sit, I fix, we eat. That's the deal." I didn't argue. I couldn't. Inside the diner, the two men fell silent when we walked in. The waitress stared for a moment before forcing a polite smile. He sat across from me, hands folded neatly on the table, rain still clinging to his hair. When the food came, eggs, toast, and black coffee, he ate slowly, as if every bite was a memory. Between sips, he said quietly, "Used to own a garage on 5th Street. Before the fire." I leaned forward. A fire? He nodded. Electrical. Took everything. My tools, my wife's piano. She didn't make it out. The world seemed to tilt for a second. I'm sorry, I whispered. He nodded, not needing the words. I kept fixing things after that. Couldn't stop. But after a while, people stopped coming. They stopped seeing me. His voice cracked on that last word. I wanted to say something, anything. But he just smiled again and added, "It's funny, isn't it? Machines break down and people rush to fix them. But when people break, everyone just steps over the pieces." The men in suits pretended not to listen, but I saw their faces change. When we finished, I insisted on paying. He didn't argue that time. We stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. He turned to me and said, "You should have that ignition checked again in a week. Corrosion like that comes back fast." "Will you be around?" I asked. He smiled. "Maybe. You never know where a good engine or a kind soul might need tuning." He started to walk away, pushing his cart, his coat catching the last light of the setting sun. And then he stopped, pulled something from his pocket, a small wrench, and knelt by the car's hood. He scratched something softly onto the metal just above the repaired part. "What are you doing?" I asked, half amused. He looked up at me and said, "Signing my work?" I leaned closer. The letters shimmered faintly under the light. J. Mercer. Something about it felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. He gave a nod, then disappeared down the street, swallowed by twilight. When I looked back at the hood, the engraving caught the fading sun, glinting like a secret I didn't yet understand. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the name, and that's when I saw it, a headline from nearly 15 years ago. Engineer Jonathan Mercer wins global award for revolutionary car engine design. My stomach dropped. It was him, the man they laughed at, the man who fixed my car for food, the man who once built engines the world had celebrated, and who now had nowhere to sleep. I sat there, staring at the screen until tears blurred the letters, because for the first time in a long time, I realized how easily we mistake circumstance for worth. I didn't sleep. Not from fear, not from caffeine, from the way a name can turn into a door. I kept scrolling, each article a window into a life I'd watched push a shopping cart through rain. Photographs of a younger man in a black suit, shoulders square, eyes bright. Headlines about efficiency curves and combustion cycles, about an engine layout that won praise for being lighter, cleaner, quieter. A photo of him at a podium with a gold plaque, another beside a woman at a piano, her head thrown back in laughter, his hand on the fallboard as if the room itself were singing. Then the turn. A fire. Electrical. A small blurb with no follow-up, just enough ink to write someone out. A civil suit that went nowhere. A bankruptcy. No photographs after that, just silence that smelled like smoke. I stared at the last image until my eyes stung. Jonathan Mercer in front of a ribbon cutting, a red bow poofed like a heart he didn't yet know would burst. The caption said, "Mercer Motors, 5th Street." I knew where that was. Old warehouses, a junkyard, a single blinking streetlight that never learned the difference between night and day. I put on sneakers and a sweater and told myself the impulse was foolish. It was after midnight. It was not safe. Those were the thoughts that keep people in their warm beds convincing themselves compassion is a morning sport. I grabbed my keys anyway. The city at that hour felt like a different animal, quieter, ribs showing, breath steaming. The diner lot where I'd met him was empty, except for a single semi idling at the far end like a patient beast. A street cleaner hissed past and left the pavement black and slick. 5th Street looked abandoned from the corner, but it wasn't. It was sleeping with one eye open. The warehouse that had once held Mercer Motors stood like a burned book. The sign was half melted, the M hung by one rusted chain like a letter that had given up. Someone had spray painted over the roll-up doors months ago, layer on layer of color until the steel remembered nothing but other people's names. In the side lot, a tangle of shopping carts, a grocery pallet, a blue tarp caught in a fence like a torn flag. "Ma'am?" The voice came soft from my left. I turned so fast my breath tripped. A woman stepped from the deeper dark, slight and straight-backed, a knit cap pulled low over gray hair. She held a paper cup with steam climbing out of it like a tiny ghost. "You shouldn't walk alone here." she said, not unkindly. I'm looking for someone, I answered, and realized how ridiculous that sounded. A man. He fixed my car today. Signed the engine. J. Mercer. She blinked, surprise flickering and then passing like a fish under a surface. She lifted her cup as if toasting an old friend. Johnny can't mind his hands, she said. You'll find him if anything hums. Anything hums? She tilted her head. Somewhere behind the warehouse, above the hush of traffic and the hum of the city's electrical heart, there was another sound. A generator trying to believe it wasn't tired. This way, she said, and I followed. We passed a mural that someone had started and never finished, two hands almost touching across a field of sky, and turned down a narrow run between buildings where the wind stacked itself and made a low animal sound. The generator sat behind a chain-link fence, the kind of machine that the city forgets until storms remind it to remember. The cage door was ajar. A man crouched beside the housing with a headlamp, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a pair of needle-nose pliers held like a promise. Even before his face lifted, I knew him by the way his shoulders made room for purpose. Evening, Johnny, the woman said, setting her cup on a cinder block. Brought a visitor? He stood, slower than he should have, like his joints had filed complaints no one had processed, and turned the lamp from my eyes. He stood, slower than he should have, like his joints had filed complaints no one had processed, and turned the lamp from my eyes. Rain had cleaned his face into years, but not into defeat. When he saw me, he smiled like someone who had guessed a punchline and didn't mind being right. You shouldn't be here, he said gently. I looked up your name. I held the words out like a fragile dish. You used to build engines, he finished for me. Not proud, not embarrassed. I still do. They're just smaller now. He tapped the generator housing. City forgot this one. If it dies, the shelter loses heat. The woman patted my arm and disappeared toward the sound of voices and tin plates, a light in her step that belonged to people who make the same long day worth doing again tomorrow. I stayed because leaving would have felt like telling a story to end before the point. Why didn't you tell me who you were? I asked, and immediately hated the question. Who was I expecting at 1 a.m.? A press conference? He shrugged and tightened a bolt with the pliers. Names make people behave different, sometimes worse. He glanced at me. Besides, I'm not that name anymore, not to the people who write things down. But to the people who need heat? He allowed himself the smallest smile. To them, I'm the man who will not let this die tonight. I watched his hands. They were the kind you expect to see holding a pen in a boardroom or resting on a piano in a quiet house. They moved like they remembered every tool they'd loved. He listened, adjusted, listened again, then reached into the housing and reconnected a thick cable with 3 practiced motions. The generator's pitch climbed from tired to steady. The alley warmed by 1 degree of sound. There, he said, and wiped his hands on a rag that had once been a shirt. Now it'll make it until morning. We'll trade with the church for diesel tomorrow. Trade? I asked. He nodded toward the mouth of the alley, toward the sleeping blocks. They have bread near closing. We fix what squeaks. The city doesn't like it when the poor invent economies, but the poor are very inventive. We walked back toward the front of the warehouse. I didn't realize I had my hand around my car keys like a talisman until he glanced at them. You still don't trust me, he said without accusation. I do, I said. It was mostly true. The rest was something else. Fear disguised as precaution. But I don't trust the world. It hasn't earned it. He looked past me at the mural, at the 2 hands that almost touched. It won't, he said. Sometimes we just do the trusting anyway. I told him about the article, about the award, about the ribbon-cutting photograph that still glowed behind my eyes like a trick of light. What happened? I asked finally. Not the headlines, the part people don't print. He took a breath that had gravel in it. We were small and believed, which is worse than being small and cynical. A supplier cut corners on wiring. I didn't catch it. My fault. Or maybe I did and pretended I didn't. My sin. The fire took the building and my wife in 12 minutes. His voice surprised itself at her name. Elise. She was teaching a student in the back room. He stopped, and the single syllable of his grief said more than the sentence would have. After that, investors wanted blood or someone else's signature. Lawyers ate years. The papers quit calling. I sold the house to pay people who hated me less than I hated myself. Then I slept in places with locks until I couldn't afford locks, and then I learned the names of all the places without them. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant each letter. He nodded without looking at me. People apologize when they don't know what else to do with their hands. We stood there a while with our hands being useless. A city bus whooshed past 2 blocks over, full of strangers who had no idea the alley had heated itself out of mercy. Somewhere a bottle broke and someone laughed like breaking glass. Come back in the morning, he said finally. It's safer, and I'll be at the shelter by 7th. They like me when the toaster misbehaves, he smirked. Toasters are dramatic, but reasonable. In the car, I sat with the engine idling, the same engine he had coaxed back to belief, until I could trust my legs. Before I pulled away, I watched him walk to the shelter door. He paused to hold it for a man carrying 3 blankets and a dignity that had holes in it, and then was gone. At home, my apartment smelled of rain and something like resolve. I wrote his name on a sticky note and set it on the counter like a candle. Then I opened my laptop and wrote a message to a coworker I barely liked and respected immensely. Do you still know anyone at Mirador Motors? She answered in under a minute because people like her don't sleep when there's a rope to pull. Why? I met someone whose work they should remember. A pause long enough to count my heartbeats. Mercer, she wrote. Yes. My fingers trembled. Come by tomorrow. Bring proof. Proof. I had an engine with his name engraved above a coil he had resuscitated in the rain. I could bring the hood. I thought madly, then laughed at myself and decided a photograph would do. The morning was kinder, the sky, the kind of imitation blue that looks like a promise it might keep. I drove back to the diner first, because that's what the story required. The suits from yesterday weren't there. Their noise had evaporated overnight like a puddle. The waitress with the polite smile had a real one today. Your friend came for coffee at 5, she said, paid with exact change and a thank you that felt like somebody's prayer. I'm looking for him, I said. The shelter on 7th? She pointed with her chin, the way people do when their hands are busy loving their work. 2 blocks, green door, sign with a candle. The shelter smelled like disinfectant and warm bread. Inside, the chaos made sense. A line of plates, a line of thanks, a clock that had been wrong so long it was right twice a day. A man in an apron was arguing with a toaster with surprising respect. The toaster won. The man swore and crossed himself, and the room laughed in a way that made it safer to be there. Johnny, someone called. The sink's doing the thing again. He was in a corner with a small machine opened like a book. He looked up before I could wave, the way people do when they have cataloged your footsteps once and then never forget them. He set his screwdriver down, wiped his hands, and walked over. You shouldn't have to keep saying it, I blurted, but I believe you. I took out my phone and opened the photograph of the engine bay with his name scratched above the coil. Will you let me show this to someone who will know what it means? Someone who can hire me? He asked. Not to tease, not to plead, just to understand the shape of the hope. Someone who can take your name out of the shadows, I said. He looked back toward the sink and the toaster and the people who needed him. I won't leave them, he said. Then we make the world come here, I answered, and the sentence surprised me by being true before it was practical. Do you have 10 minutes? I know a woman whose emails don't get ignored. We stepped onto the little concrete square outside the shelter, the one with a potted plant that someone kept alive with a stubborn generosity. And I dialed. Put me on speaker with someone who can read an engine like a poem, I texted first, because my coworker had taught me you don't waste a good ask on a small door. Then I pressed call. 3 voices later, my coworker, her friend at Mirador, a technical director who sounded like he'd been asleep with his shoes on, a video window opened. I angled the camera over the fender to the coil and the scrawl above it. Who signed that? The director asked, the impatience stripped clean off his voice. Jay Mercer, I said. Silence made room for the past to arrive. I thought I heard someone swallow. Where did you find him? The director asked, quieter. He found me, I said, and Jonathan put his hands in his pockets like a boy at graduation. Is he there? The director asked. He is, Mr. Mercer, the man said, and the mister did something to the air between us. I've spent half my career trying to explain why you were right. If you're willing, we'd like to. He hesitated, because men with degrees and budgets shouldn't have to say this, but sometimes must. We'd like to learn from you. We have a prototype that keeps stalling under load. I've tried everything but listening. Jonathan glanced at me like a person at the edge of a vast field he used to run. He said nothing for a long moment. Then simply, "Bring it here." The director laughed. Real joy, not corporate. "We can send a truck," he said, recovering. "Or you could come." "No," Jonathan said, not unkindly. "If it matters, you can make it matter here." There was a quiet conference on the other end, the roiling of calendars, the slap of egos settling themselves into chairs. "This afternoon," the director said, 2:00. After the call, the shelter's door opened and the smell of soup swung out like a bell. The gray-haired woman from last night set a bowl on the stoop and looked at Jonathan as if he'd grown back something he'd been missing. "You going to be famous again?" she asked, smirking. He shook his head. "No, Elma, just useful." By noon, word had walked ahead of the truck. The alley filled first with curiosity, then with skepticism. Men folding their arms the way men do when they want their uncertainty to look like protection. "What's this, then?" one asked. "A TV thing?" "Better," Alma said. "A work thing." The truck appeared like a stage direction. They rolled down a long ramp, a sleek, unbadged prototype in primer paint. A bird not yet colored. 2 engineers hopped out, clean shoes stepping into a street that wasn't afraid to scuff them. 2 engineers hopped out, clean shoes stepping into a street that wasn't afraid to scuff them. The younger one had the face of a person who wants to be on the right side of history and isn't sure which side that is until someone wiser points. The older one held a tablet like a shield. "Mr. Mercer," the older said, almost bowing. "It's an honor." Jonathan waved this away. Mercies make him itch, and motioned the car into the alley so the sun wouldn't lie to it. He asked for nothing fancy. A stethoscope of rubber hose, a socket set, a clean rag. The engineers produced what they had, and the rest arrived from the shelter like magic, because that's what happens when a neighborhood decides you're allowed to try. He listened first. Of course he did. He tilted his head, hand hovering over the intake, eyes half closed like a priest at an altar, like a musician tuning a room to itself. "Your air-fueled trim's lying to you," he said finally, gently, as if telling a child it hadn't failed a test so much as misunderstood the question. "Your sensors whispering, your maps shouting. They don't trust each other. They idle fine out of pride and quit when asked to agree." The younger engineer laughed in disbelief. "We've been chasing that for 3 months. Jonathan looked up. "You've been measuring," he said. "You haven't been listening? Can you fix it?" the older asked. "I can make it tell the truth," Jonathan said. He asked for nothing you couldn't buy at a parts store if you still had a name on file. And then he did something small and holy. He cleaned a ground strap the way a person cleans a headstone. He shimmed a sensor that had been sitting at an angle only arrogance can defend. He adjusted a throttle, stopped 1/8 of a turn, and waited for the engine to forgive them. The prototype coughed once, twice, then found itself. The idle settled into a sentence that made sense. He nodded to the younger engineer to bring the load up, and when it didn't stumble, the alley exhaled. The suits would have clapped if clapping hadn't. Felt like breaking something delicate. Alma did it for them. 2 solid smacks of her hand on her knee. "Buy the man a sandwich," she commanded the world. The older engineer looked like a person who had seen a magician palm a coin and wanted to learn humility for the first time. "How did you—" Jonathan pointed to the ground strap. "Electricity is a snob," he said. "It wants proper introductions." He pointed to the sensor. "Don't ask a map to sing and then blame it for being a map." He pointed to the throttle stop. "Motors need a reason to start telling the truth. Give them a breath they can trust." The older engineer took off his glasses and wiped, his eyes with the heel of his hand, surprised by himself. He turned to the tablet and awkwardly to me. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm nobody," I said. It came out sharper than I intended. "She's the reason you're here," Alma corrected, and I loved her at once for her refusal to let the story be lazy. The older engineer nodded in a way that made me feel seen but not consumed. When it was over, when the car had been loaded back up with something like respect, when the engineers had shaken hands like men, who know they had been lent a day they didn't deserve, Jonathan leaned on the fence and looked tired in the way mountains looked tired at dusk. "You could go back," I said softly. Not to that life, maybe to a new one. They need you? He looked at the shelter door. So do they. Then say yes to both, I said, because some sentences can be true twice if you let them. He smiled, wary of hope, but not unwilling to hold it for a minute. They'll laugh, he said. Until you sign the engine, I answered. And we both watched as the truck's taillights turned the alley briefly red, like an apology for all the red lights that had ever stopped him. That afternoon, the two men from the diner found their way to 5th Street, hunger dressed as curiosity. They stood with their hands in the safe pockets of their entitlement and watched the man they had mocked adjust a machine the city would one day applaud. When Jonathan finished, he reached for the small wrench he kept in his pocket like a prayer and scratched his name on the bracket he'd corrected. Not as a flourish, not as revenge, just as a record that something had been loved. The suits read it, J. Mercer, and their faces learned something late. I took a picture of the signature in the good light. My coworker texted a single thumbs up. The technical director sent 4 letters. Come Monday? I showed the screen to Jonathan. He didn't answer right away. He watched Alma hand a bowl of soup to a man whose hands shook until they didn't. He watched the generator hum like a promise it intended to keep. He watched my face, maybe, to see if I'd flinch when he said what he needed to say. I'll come, he said, but not if it means leaving. He looked at me. Will you help me build a bridge instead of a door? Yes, I said, before practicality could raise its hand. The wind shifted and brought the smell of bread from the shelter kitchen. Someone inside cursed the toaster and then thanked it. A bus sighed on 7th. The 2 hands on the mural still hadn't touched, but they were closer in this light. That night, when I finally slept, it was with the image of a name scratched into metal where the world could see it, and a man leaning over an engine listening for truth. I dreamed of small tools and large mercies, and of a city that hadn't earned our trust and got it anyway. Because sometimes we don't fix the world by turning a bolt. We fix it by deciding the person holding the wrench is still worth the title they used to wear. It started with the smell of bread. Warm, yeasty, and impossible to ignore, like memory baked into air. That morning, the shelter's kitchen buzzed like a factory of second chances. Pans hissed, people laughed, a radio played something old and hopeful. And in the corner, sitting with a mug of black coffee gone cold, was Jonathan Mercer, the man I'd watched resurrect engines and people in the same breath. He looked up when I entered. His smile was small but real. You came back, he said. Of course I did, I replied. You asked me to help build a bridge. He chuckled, shaking his head. Most people forget things like that. I'm not most people. He studied me for a moment, not the kind of studying that makes you nervous, but the kind that makes you feel visible. Then he gestured toward the back. There's something I want you to see. The storage room behind the kitchen was chaos. Boxes stacked like memories, broken fans, old microwaves, coils of wire tangled like sleeping snakes. I fix what I can, he said, stepping over a broken chair. When people donate things, they never ask if they still work. I make them work again. There, under the hum of the generator he'd saved, was a table covered in blueprints, hand-drawn, precise. What's this? I asked, picking up one of the sheets. He wiped his hands on his shirt and looked embarrassed, like a child caught painting on the walls. It's a hybrid layout, something that could fit older engines, cheap parts, but efficient. I've been thinking, what if people who can't afford new cars could still drive something clean? You're designing again, I said softly. He smiled almost shyly. Guess you can't unlearn purpose. At noon, the first message came. It was from Mirador Motors, the company whose engineers had visited the shelter the day before. Jonathan, we'd like you to join as a consultant on a pilot program. We'll bring the work here if that's what it takes. He read it twice, then slid the phone toward me. What do you think? I think the bridge is already half built, I said. But he looked uncertain. I'm not sure I fit in that world anymore. Then don't fit, I said. Build your own space between them. He leaned back, eyes soft with thought. You make it sound simple. It's not, I said, smiling. That's why it's worth doing. That afternoon, Mirador sent a van. Not fancy, not loud, just white with a small logo on the side. 2 engineers got out with toolboxes and cautious optimism. The younger one, Max, nodded politely. We're supposed to help Mr. Mercer set up a workspace. Jonathan gestured to the far end of the warehouse. There's space there, but watch your step. Some of the floorboards think gravity's optional. They laughed awkwardly, and something about their laughter softened the air. By evening, they had assembled a modest workshop, a workbench, a 3D printer, a diagnostic screen that flickered when it wanted attention. It wasn't much, but it was his. When they left, I stayed. He stood beside the table, staring at his tools like an artist looking at brushes after a long exile. "I don't remember the last time someone trusted me with this much," he murmured. "Maybe that's because you stopped trusting yourself," I said gently. He looked up, startled. "You think I did?" "I think you punished yourself long enough for something you couldn't change." He didn't answer. He just turned away, his jaw tight. But I saw it. The quiet tremor in his shoulders, the unspoken truth he wasn't ready to let out. A week passed like a slow thaw. Every morning I'd stop by the shelter before work, sometimes bringing breakfast, sometimes just listening. And every morning he was there before dawn, sleeves rolled, tinkering with something new. He worked with the patience of someone who had learned that time could be both enemy and ally. People began to notice. The residents who once kept their eyes on the ground now lingered by the workshop, offering scraps of advice, jokes, coffee. One man, Peter, an ex-truck driver, started helping him sort parts. Another, Alma, became his unofficial manager, yelling at anyone who touched the wrong wrench. Soon the alley outside smelled like oil and bread, a strange, perfect combination of survival. Then came the local reporter. She showed up one morning with a camera and a notebook. "Are you the man who fixed Mirador's engine?" she asked. Jonathan froze. "I didn't fix a company. I fixed a machine." "But you used to be—" He stopped her gently. "I used to be a lot of things. Now I'm just someone who builds what's missing." I thought that would end it. But by the next week, his story was everywhere. The genius in the alley. Once famous engineer rebuilds hope. Homeless mechanic turns shelter into workshop. He hated it. "They're turning it into a headline," he said one night, pacing. "They don't care about the people here. They just want redemption they can sell." "They're giving you a platform," I said. "Use it." He looked at me, eyes burning. "You don't understand. I don't want to be forgiven. I want to be useful." His words hung in the air, raw and honest. I stepped closer. "Maybe being useful is how you forgive yourself." He didn't answer, but something in his face changed. A crack in the armor. Mirador kept their promise. They brought parts, equipment, even interns. Young engineers eager to learn from a legend they'd only read about. Jonathan taught them without realizing he was teaching. He'd pause between sentences asking, "Do you hear that hum? That's alignment. When a machine believes you." They'd laugh, thinking it was poetry. But I knew it was faith. One evening, after everyone had gone, I found him sitting outside, the sky bruised with twilight. "You're quieter tonight," I said. He smiled faintly. "I've been thinking about Elise." "Your wife?" He nodded. "She used to say I could fix anything except myself." He paused, his eyes distant. "I wish she could see this." "She does," I said softly. He looked at me, puzzled. "You don't bring light back into a place like this," I said, "without someone guiding your hands." For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small wrench, the one he always used to sign his work. "I stopped carrying this after the fire," he said, "but I think I'm ready to use it again." The next morning, Mirador's director himself came to visit. He was a tall man with silver hair and a voice that carried both authority and guilt. "Mr. Mercer," he said, shaking his hand, "you've caused quite a stir." "I didn't mean to cause anything," Jonathan said. The man smiled. Sometimes purpose does that. He gestured around the shelter. This could be something special. What if we turned it into a program? A training hub?" Jonathan blinked. "You want to turn the shelter into a school?" "Into a workshop," the man said, "with you as its mentor." Jonathan looked at me. "What do you think?" I smiled. "I think the bridge just found its name." That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed at the table sketching designs. Not for engines, but for workbenches, diagrams, schedules. The next morning, there was a new sign above the door, painted by Alma herself. "The Mercer Workshop, where second chances run clean." I stood beside him as he read it, eyes wet but steady. "I didn't ask for this," he whispered. "No," I said, "but you built it anyway." He ran his hand over the wood. "You think people will come?" I laughed softly. They already are. Behind us, the hum of the generator rose. Warm, steady, familiar. The same sound that had brought me back that first night. The sound of something broken learning how to work again. They came in waves. By the end of that month, the Mercer workshop wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was alive. The air hummed with purpose, with the clatter of tools, the murmur of engines, and laughter that had learned to echo again. People who once flinched at noise were now making it. Honest noise, the sound of usefulness. The kind that drowns out shame. Jonathan called it the orchestra, and he was its conductor. Every morning, before sunrise, he'd walk through the aisles of half-fixed machines like a priest among parishioners, checking the alignment of bolts and the faith of hands. He never raised his voice, never rushed anyone. He'd say, "Don't force the screw, let it find its thread." And somehow that meant more than mechanics. It was philosophy disguised as guidance. The media tried to catch on again. Local channels came by with microphones and smiles too wide for sincerity. Jonathan tolerated them. The way you tolerate a storm, you know will pass. He'd stand by the workbench, rag in hand, and say things like, "I'm not building engines, I'm building confidence. That's harder to keep running." The reporters would nod, pretending they understood. They didn't. I stayed close through it all, not because he needed me, but because I needed him. Watching him work was like watching grief turn into grace. One afternoon, a car pulled up to the curb, a sleek black sedan polished to reflection. A man stepped out in a suit that looked too expensive for this street. His shoes crunched on gravel that had never met that kind of leather. Jonathan froze mid-sentence when he saw him. The wrench slipped from his hand and hit the floor. The man smiled, not kindly, but with the careful control of someone rehearsed in apologies that never truly cost him anything. "Hello, Mercer," he said. The workshop went still. Even the generator seemed to hesitate. Jonathan took a slow breath. "Daniels," he said flatly. "Didn't expect to see you crawl out of your boardroom." Daniels, the investor, the one from the old articles. The man who had been there when the fire burned Mercer Motors to the ground. He stepped closer, hands raised slightly as if to say, "I'm not here to fight. I heard about what you're doing here," Daniels began. "It's remarkable. Really. Redemption stories sell better than anything these days." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "If you came to buy a headline, you're too late. The people here already own the truth." I could feel the tension coil between them, thick as smoke. Daniels exhaled. "I came to make things right." Jonathan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Now that it costs you nothing?" The man didn't flinch. "It cost me my company, my reputation. I thought you died in that fire, John. You left before the investigation, before—" Jonathan cut him off. "Before you blamed me." Daniels took another step closer, lowering his voice. "I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself. We both know that wiring wasn't your fault." Silence. Heavy, old, uninvited. The others in the room shifted, pretending not to listen, but listening all the same. "Then why didn't you say it?" Jonathan asked quietly. Daniels' voice cracked. "Because grief makes cowards of us all." Jonathan looked away, eyes burning. "You let me burn too." I wanted to intervene, to say enough, but I knew this wasn't my place. This was between ghosts. Daniels took a breath. "Let me help, John. I can fund this place properly. Equipment, housing, training. You wouldn't have to scrape by with donations." Jonathan turned back to him, calm again. Too calm? "You think money can fix what guilt broke?" Daniels hesitated. "It can build something new." Jonathan stepped closer until they were face to face. "Then write the check, but not to me. To them. To the people who slept in the cold while you counted profits. To the woman who feeds them. To the kid who just wants to learn how to fix what the world breaks. If you want redemption, start there." Daniels swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll do it." Jonathan stared at him a long time before saying, "Then maybe we'll both get to sleep again." That evening, after Daniels left, the workshop buzzed with quiet awe. Word spread fast. They'd just been funded for a full year. New tools, proper insulation, meals guaranteed. But Jonathan didn't smile. He sat at the edge of the loading dock, staring at his hands like he'd just come back from a war he wasn't sure he'd won. I sat beside him. "You did the right thing," I said. He nodded. Doesn't feel like it, because forgiveness never does, I said softly. He turned to me. He was right about one thing. I left before the fire reached her. I thought I could save the designs, the future, the business. I should have stayed with Elise. His voice broke, and he let it. He'd been holding that sentence for years. She wouldn't have wanted you to die there, I said. She died thinking I did. The words fell between us like ash. I placed my hand over his, a simple, human thing. Then live in a way that proves her wrong. He looked at me then. Really looked. You make everything sound possible only because you already made the impossible work, I said, smiling. Days blurred into purpose again. The donation arrived. Supplies filled the workshop shelves. New faces showed up. Young mechanics, veterans, single mothers, teenagers who dropped out but hadn't stopped dreaming. They called it the Engine of Mercy, because that's what Jonathan had become. A man who took what the world threw away and made it run again. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just his name, written in elegant handwriting. He opened it slowly. I watched his face change, confusion, disbelief, and then something like wonder. He handed it to me with trembling fingers. It read, Mr. Mercer, you don't know me, but my mother did. She was Elise's student the day of the fire. She told me how you tried to go back for her, how you fought the flames until they pulled you out. She said you screamed her name until your voice broke. I wanted you to know. She didn't die afraid. She died proud of you. I thought you should hear that from someone who owes you her life. Clara! Jonathan pressed the paper to his chest, eyes shut. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, She forgave me first. That evening, the workshop stayed open late. He gathered everyone, mechanics, residents, volunteers, and said quietly, We build machines. But today, I want to build something else. He picked up the wrench he always used to sign his work, then turned to the wall by the entrance, a clean, white panel. He scratched 5 words into it. Not his name this time. Just this. For her, for all of us. After that, something changed in him. He moved lighter, spoke gentler, laughed easier. He started mentoring kids from the local high school, kids who thought engineer was a word for people in suits, not people with calloused hands. He taught them about balance, torque, patience, but also about life. Every engine runs better, he'd say, when you stop forcing it to be perfect. One day, I caught him humming while tightening a bolt. It was the same tune I'd once heard him whistle absent-mindedly at the diner months ago. I smiled. That's new. He looked up. It's old. I just stopped being afraid of remembering it. By winter, the workshop's sign gleamed against the frost, and the hum of restored cars filled the street like steady heartbeats. People still came by to watch, not out of pity, but respect. The world that once laughed at a homeless man fixing cars for food now lined up to shake his hand. But Jonathan Mercer never changed how he signed his work. Always the same way. Small, neat, unassuming. J. Mercer. And beside it now, sometimes he'd add a second line. One he'd whisper every time the engine started clean and strong. For Elise. Winter came slow that year. Not the violent kind of cold that breaks things, but the quiet kind that teaches them to hold together. Snow dusted the roofs around the Mercer workshop, and the exhaust from rebuilt engines rose into the air like breath from something reborn. Inside, the smell of oil and fresh bread still mingled, the scent of industry and grace. Jonathan stood near the door, mug of coffee in hand, watching as Alma scolded a teenager for over-tightening a bolt. The boy apologized, and Jonathan laughed. Let him make mistakes, he said. Engines are like people. They don't need perfection, just patience. He looked older now, not weaker, just worn in, like a tool that had finally found its purpose again. I watched him from across the room and thought of that first night in the rain, a stranger with grease on his hands and hunger in his eyes. How strange that one small act of kindness had turned into this, a building full of lives in motion. But the world outside had started watching again. After the article about the workshop went viral, the story spread. Not the twisted version full of pity and scandal, but the real one. A once famous engineer who lost everything, built hope from nothing, and taught a broken city to listen again. Messages flooded in, journalists, investors, engineers, politicians, and among them, an invitation. To Mr. Jonathan Mercer. You are cordially invited to receive the Global Humanitarian Engineering Award for Outstanding Community Contribution. Ceremony to be held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, Washington, D.C. He stared at it for a long time, expression unreadable. I don't belong in places like that anymore, he said finally. Then maybe it's time you walked back in, I said. Not for them, for everyone here who believes in you. He folded the letter and slipped it into his coat. We'll see. The night of the ceremony, he almost didn't go. He stood in front of the mirror in a borrowed suit that fit just well enough to remind him of what he used to be. His tie hung loose. His shoes were too new. I found him staring at the wrench he always carried, the one he used to sign every piece he fixed. Bring it, I said. He frowned. It doesn't belong there. It belongs anywhere you do, I answered. The ballroom shimmered with glass and arrogance. Men in tuxedos shook hands like contracts. Women in gowns smiled like polished secrets. When Jonathan walked in, the noise shifted. Not quiet, exactly, but respectful in a way that didn't come often. Some recognized him instantly. Others whispered his name like a ghost they hadn't expected to see. He stood straight, shoulders square, eyes calm. The host approached the microphone. Tonight, we honor a man who redefined what engineering means. Not as invention, but as compassion. A man who rebuilt lives as easily as he rebuilt engines. Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. Jonathan walked to the stage slowly, like every step was part of a life he'd finally made peace with. When he reached the podium, he didn't unfold the speech they'd written for him. He set it aside and spoke from the heart. I used to think engineering was about control, he began. Precision, order, the perfect formula to keep chaos away. But then life broke down, and there was no formula for that. For a long time, I thought I'd lost everything worth fixing. But one day, in the rain, a stranger gave me something more powerful than a wrench. He looked at me, and I felt my throat tighten. She gave me trust. The room went silent. Even the cameras stopped clicking. I spent years believing I didn't deserve a second chance. But I learned something working with the people the world forgot. The ones you step over on your way to somewhere important. They don't need charity. They need tools. Give them purpose, and they'll fix the world themselves. Applause started quietly. Then it grew, rising like a wave, filling the hall. Some people stood. Some wiped their eyes. Jonathan stepped back, overwhelmed. As he left the stage, the host handed him the glass award. He looked down at it and smiled faintly. Then he turned it over and, with the wrench in his pocket, scratched 3 letters on the base. J. Mercer. When we left the hotel that night, snow had started to fall again. The streetlights turned it gold. He walked beside me in silence until we reached the car. They'll want interviews, endorsements, all of it, I said. What are you going to tell them? He smiled. That I have engines waiting. The next morning, he was back at the workshop before sunrise. He placed the award on the shelf above the workbench, right beside Alma's painted sign. A few of the kids stopped to look at it. Is that real? One asked. Jonathan nodded. It's glass, fragile, just like everything worth earning. He turned back to the half-assembled engine and said, Come on, let's make something stronger. Months later, when Mirador announced their new line of eco-engines, they unveiled a plaque under the hood of each one, dedicated to Jonathan Mercer, the man who taught us to listen. But at the Mercer workshop, no one needed plaques to remember. They remembered by sound, the rhythm of pistons, the hum of community, the steady heartbeat of machines and people learning to run again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, Jonathan called me outside. Listen, he said. At first I thought he meant the street, but then I heard it. Faint but real. Laughter, music, footsteps, engines, the sound of life in motion. That's what forgiveness sounds like, he whispered. I looked at him, and for a moment, he wasn't the man who'd lived in the shadows. He was the man Elise must have seen every day. Before I left that night, he handed me the small wrench, his signature tool. I don't need it anymore, he said. It's time someone else learned how to sign their work. I closed my hand around it. What if I break something? He smiled. Then fix it. That's what we do. Weeks later, when he passed away quietly in his sleep, surrounded by people who owed him more than words, the city dimmed its lights for 1 minute. The mayor gave a speech. The papers called him the Engineer of Mercy. But at the workshop, Alma simply hung his wrench above the door with a note. If something stops working, remember, patience first, force never. and below it, in his handwriting, J. Mercer.